Right. Well, I'm delighted to see as many of you are still here as were here, I think, at the start yesterday morning, or certainly it's the same kind of numbers. So great to see that so many of you have stayed through the conference. So this is our last session, Deterrence, Are We Ready? And we've got a fabulous panel, so join me in welcoming them to the stage. Frank, and then Marina, if you go there. Kevin.
What do you want me, mate?
Kevin, you go there, and then Andy, and yeah, we've got the military. So, I mean, just listening in on the sessions and obviously having chaired some of them, we're trying to draw together the big themes of the Are We Ready? And in broad terms, we're going to have a discussion up here where we talk about the kind of to-do list in the military sense first, then in the political sense, and then just getting the feeling from some of the panels that the decision makers and the militaries and the intelligence seem to get the gravity of this moment, but there's still a lag in public understanding. We'll talk about politics, stratcoms, you know, how is the dial going to be moved with the public opinion in Western countries. So to lead off on the kind of question of capabilities and what needs to be done, let's start with Frank Miller, who was a Pentagon and White House official for many years. And if you lead off, Frank, then we'll...
Okay, thanks, Mark. So my view of capabilities is this holy grail of integrated deterrence, which means we use, and never have, sort of whole of government, which is spelled with a W, not an H. And it begins with a foundation of info ops and public comms in the gray area, because our publics and potential enemy publics need to understand what our threat is. And then, as I see it, we move on to sort of 4 areas now from there, and that's conventional, cyber, space, nuclear. And in all of those areas, I think we are sort of flashing amber to going green, but it's still a work in progress. And as far as integrated deterrence, I don't think we are there, either as the United States or as the alliance. I just don't think we have put it all together, because we tend to ignore the lower end of the spectrum.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to Lieutenant General Andy Harrison, who, well, distinguished military career, as you can see. The last 9 years working for American 4-stars, most recently in Korea. What's on top of your list in terms of capability and what needs to be done?
For me, it's getting out of the mindset that we can and must do everything, because that leaves us too thin across the board, and we simply can't afford to do it as a sovereign nation. So what? So therefore, it is understanding what trusted allies can do and then being prepared to work with them into the future in a way that allows us to bring together in concert all the capabilities against that adversary when the moment is right. So
I'm immediately going to pick you up. What shouldn't we be doing then?
Well,
what can we let go?
Therein lies the rub. And I remember, and Ed might remember it, we had a discussion about cutting a capability with the previous government, which was our Nimrod aircraft. And of course, about a month after it had been cut, we lost a yacht in the Atlantic, and the Prime Minister's order was, Air Force, go and find that yacht. And we ended up sending Hercules aircraft with crew with binoculars about half an hour on the edge of their capability, and the Prime Minister saying, why, you know, if I spend, at that stage it was about 30 billion on defence, can't I find a yacht in the Atlantic? So I'm not saying where we should cut, because I think that's the purpose of the government, to look at through the review with experts across all the field, and then a leader making that decision. But I don't think that's for me as an expert in one area to say.
All right, thank you. Now we'd have to send someone to find the Hercules, but let's move on to Air Marshal Ed Stringer, Distinguished fast jet career, Jaguars, number of operational tours and theatres, and then director of the Defence Academy, and now on the board of the Imperial War Museum with Stephen Smith and myself. Capabilities. Sorry, Ed.
I wondered whether you had to come back on the Herc. It was too much of a soft lob, Andy, to offer to Mark that one. The first job I did in the Ministry of Defence in 2003 was in an organisation set up by the then Secretary of State for Defence, and we worked directly for him, Malcolm Rifkind. And that's because we had been spending 4% of GDP on defence, and after '89 we started to spend less, and no one was being honest with him about where we were taking the cuts. And our job was to go and peel back the veneer of a very capable front line, which you still have in the UK if you're a UK taxpayer, and assess just where the strength in depth was, because there was an understanding then that behind that front line you needed the spares, you needed the war stocks, and those had to last you for long enough, just long enough for you to ramp up the defence industrial base. And we had a formula for auditing the front line to check it was credible. And we knew that our friends and allies and our enemies were doing the same. The US Embassy in London is always working out just what a good ally we're going to be. And we know that the Russians and the Chinese will do the same. Those decades since, where we've done what you might call discretionary operations, and where we've got out of the habit of that thinking, have allowed us to seduce ourselves that that veneer is all that we need and we can take it on exercise. It still does as well as all the other armed forces in the world for the week or the 2 weeks of the exercise. We need to get back to thinking about where that strength in depth is, because those areas that do things like, and my final point, Mark, say counter-terrorism, well, we can deter terrorists quite well because that national integrated, your word, counter-terrorism effort in the UK is pretty good. But if you're asking about peer threats, if you're asking about would Russia and China look at us, they might turn around and say there'll be a really hard force to defeat for about 2.5 days.
Absolutely. Well, look, we've got to bring Kevin Rudd in now, former Prime Minister of Australia, but also Foreign Minister and Defence Minister and now Ambassador to the US.
Never Defence Minister.
Oh, I beg your pardon. But, well...
Wait, are we on or off the record?
We're on.
The situation is excellent. There are no problems.
Excellent. Kevin, look, we've heard about some of the points there, and I think, in a way, what I take from those couple of answers, or 3 answers, is there's still lots of capability with Western armed forces. Perhaps we underestimate it. The key question then, I guess, is about political will. In the last session, we heard a phrase being used, deterrence deficit, in certain parts of the world, in certain scenarios. What do you feel is the state of resolution or irresolution in terms of Western political leadership at the moment and willingness to take hard decisions vis-à-vis Russia, China, Iran?
I think it's important to step back for one moment and just say, well, what is deterrence? And we understand at a broad conceptual level what it is in terms of the perception of those who are seeking to deter, which is to cause them to do things they would otherwise not do, or to cause them not to do things that they would prefer to do because of the risk or threat of damage to themselves or to their interests. We look at the arms of deterrence. The arms of deterrence are about capability. They're about our own national resilience and the perception of our national resilience, and they're about political will vis-à-vis A and B above. So for deterrence to be effective, it has to be those 3 components, and in our case as allies and democracies, across a whole bunch of us. And that's the tricky bit in terms of getting it right. The question which was touched on before vis-à-vis integrated deterrence, the concept is absolutely right in terms of the full gamut of statecraft, from the hard stuff, hard-edge military capabilities, which cause, certainly as I would see it, the Central Military Commission, the People's Republic of China, to say, oh my God, they've got that, through to the other end of the spectrum, which is all about information and all points in between. And having been in the United States now for the better part of a decade, running think tanks for the most of the time when I could shoot my mouth off happily, and now being a responsible Australian diplomat, a little too much of a giggle there, is that we still have a ways to go in terms of, frankly, populating the integrated deterrence framework, both the United States and, frankly, all of us together. On the political will front, I'm not going to comment on the United States, that's for the United States to resolve among itself, but at a broader level across allies, if the analysis is right that we are facing pacing threats, if we are looking at the day-to-day threat of cyber attack, which has a materiality which extends way beyond geography, then my experience of as a political practitioner is if the analysis is shared at a wider community level, then frankly political resolve then follows. If you constrain the information flow to the community at large, then you have a parallel problem in terms of the degree of, shall I say, political license and political resolve. So I think where we are at the moment is that we are on this journey, we are on this trajectory, but there is a ways to go. Applied specifically to AUKUS projects, for example, we are at the beginning of what will be a long process, but urgent process nonetheless, of explaining the strategic rationale across the board, and to therefore create the political space and therefore political will to deploy what we need to do to make it work in reality. At the end of the day, I'll just say this about the Chinese, Marxist-Leninists have a clear understanding of the application of statecraft. They are highly disciplined at these things. I'm speaking of the Chinese system. Given the nature of the challenge we face for the future, we will need to exhibit a comparable resolve and comparable discipline in the way in which we go about things, which historically we've not had to do since 1991.
On China, just looking at the reporting over the last 36 hours about the exercises, you know, it's a familiar pattern. Flood the air and sea space around Taiwan with PLA and PLAN aircraft, ships, create this kind of sense that if we wanted to switch on a blockade, we could do it tomorrow, create a sense among the Taiwanese that kind of resistance is futile. What is the correct Western response? How does the West show will in terms of that activity, which is becoming such a sort of frequent occurrence in that part of the world?
I think we've got to get our analysis right first, and then we should define appropriate responses. This has been a post-2022 Chinese phenomenon of, shall we say, exercising surrounding the island since Speaker Pelosi's visit in, I think from memory, August of that year. Prior to that, the median line, by and large, across the Taiwan Straits was respected. Now it's not. By and large, prior to that time, you had very few examples of whole of island, whole round of island activity, applying multiple arms of the Chinese military. And prior to 2022, we saw limited activity against Taiwan's offshore islands, you know, Jinmen, Mazu, and the rest. So this is actually relatively recent. So we need to understand this has not been the norm since 1949. It's not been the norm since the last Taiwan Straits crisis of 1995, 1996. It is the post-2022 norm. So what's the appropriate set of policy tools to respond? When we look at Taiwan contingencies for the future, they're usually broken down into three sets of boxes. One is grey zone activity. The second is the blockade, as often discussed. And the third is the full-scale military invasion. What we are seeing at present are variations in and around the first, not so much the second. And around the first, the real policy challenge for policymakers around the world is how do you effectively deter the People's Republic of China from continuing to accelerate grey zone activity to the point that it begins to achieve any of its stated, or unstated, I should say, political and policy objectives. There is a recent useful study to examine produced by the American Enterprise Institute in AEI in Washington on grey zone as it applies to Taiwan, and the fact that deterrence, if we are to be mindful about its discipline, will have to extend to those activities and not just blockade and not just deterrence against the prospect or the possibility of a full-scale military invasion. The final point I'd make, though, is someone who, as a kid, and has studied in Taiwan. I did my Chinese there. I've been to Taiwan stacks of times over the years, not since I was Prime Minister, is frankly against China's stated military objective, which is to soften up Taiwanese domestic political opinion and social attitudes. I think it is having zero to negative effect. And so against the policy objective which some in Beijing would establish for this sort of activity we now see as a response of William Lai's inauguration several days ago, I don't think it achieves any policy objective in relation to the Taiwanese. I suspect its service point is to be an exercise directed at the Chinese Communist Party itself to demonstrate internally to the regime that they take Taiwanese independence still seriously.
But I think, if I might...
Sorry, can I just bring in Marina Henke from the Hertie School, German policy and government school like Blavatnik and Kennedy. We spoke yesterday. Marina, I wanted to pick up on something Kevin Rudd said there, where he said, correct me if I'm paraphrasing you wrong, Kevin, but if we share our assessment, then political will usually falls into place. Now, I'm not sure whether you meant that in the very literal sense of like an intelligence assessment, in which case we often see the Five Eyes countries falling easily into place. But what about alliance solidarity more generally? Because we were talking about that yesterday in relation to Germany.
I politely disagree with you. We've talked a lot about the axis of tyranny during these last 2 days. And I think if the West of the democracies of this world stand together, we're unbeatable. But actually, I think this unity that Putin was very much impressed by in the first months and until now still lasting is very fragile. And I think it's fragile internally. Most of our countries, certainly mine and Germany, but also the UK, also the United States, I assume also Australia, we're facing domestic forces that might actually undermine the resolve that we show vis-a-vis this tyranny of China, Russia, and Iran. But I think also, and we should put it all on the table, it's not just about a confluence of an analysis. There's jealousy, there's competition, there are just interests, economic interests, political interests that might divide our countries. And I think if we actually let them rule...
I'm shocked that states could be jealous of each other. So.
But
German economic interest in China is a very live...
But we all do. I suppose, pardon me for interrupting, but that's just the natural condition among allies and democracies, and it's been that way since the get-go. The value added we have is that when we do deploy, and do deploy conjointly, based on a common worldview and common threat perception, frankly, our adversaries and our opponents and our competitors are deeply concerned by that.
Sorry, Frank.
Can I just add something very quickly?
Yes, please do, Marina.
That we need to be consciously working towards creating and maintaining this unity, because I don't think it's automatic. You're speaking of a deployment. In the case of Russia right now, there is no deployment, right? We're aiding Ukraine. And so I think here, keeping us all together, whether this is in Asia Pacific or whether this is in the European theater, I think affords much more effort from our side, from Great Britain, also from continental Europe, from the United States, and from our Asian allies, than just, counting on
Frank,
automatic.
can I just direct the question? Sorry, and please make whichever point you're about.
Yeah, sure.
But in terms of this idea about solidarity, shared threat perception, and I took the signal, Kevin, that you didn't really want me to ask you about a Trump presidency, but can I ask you then, Frank? I mean, what happens then to the alliance and these...
Well, I'll answer the question.
Yeah, but after the point.
The second place where I wanted to go, which is, look, it is right and proper for us to have fears. It is absolutely wrong for us to act on our fears. And there is the danger that by acting on our fears, we bring about the very kind of consequences that we're concerned about. So until Donald Trump is president and until he unveils policies that are inimical to what we all believe in, then I think we watch it and we don't act on it. I think the second thing I wanted to say is I agree, our governments have failed collectively, by and large, in strengthening public opinion about the threat and about the need for unity. In Europe, all the NATO governments need to talk about NATO, NATO, NATO. This talk about a Euro deterrent is farcical, I'm afraid, but that's where we are. In the Pacific, I think, again, AUKUS and these kinds of things, putting more U.S. submarines in there, working exercises with the Australians and the Japanese and the South Koreans is sending a signal. And in Europe, I mean, what, for 10 years now we've had the troops in the Baltics, NATO troops in the Baltics. So that sends a signal of our will. The last thing is to convince Xi and Putin, who are the people we care about, not to cross the line and to attack. I mean, we don't have anything about deterring, encircling Taiwan. We do have things about attacking our allies. And I think they get that.
Sorry, Ed, you want to come in?
To support what Frank said, to be grown up about our major ally has an election. We will deal with whatever comes out of that election. Of course we will. But in the meantime, it would be fair to point out that every American president has said, just in different ways, Europe, given its demography, given its economy, could be spending more on its own defence. And we have other things to worry about. So I think regardless of the election, there is a case to be made that European NATO could step up and become a bit more organised, and it would show itself it was a better player in the alliance. That would help our American friends sell a perfectly sensible thing to a putative President Trump. And just before I go, we need to be grown up as well as military people about what really will help in places like Asia Pacific, and it is a science and technology competition. So sending our armed forces on token deployments that almost will not be noticed by the PLA or the PLAN is one thing. Maybe it worked, maybe it doesn't. But AUKUS has the power to be transformational, and that building a combined science and technology base is something that will benefit us in many ways. So it's been grown up, and as you said, integrated across all those levels.
Just wanted to pick up, actually with you as well, Marina, but initially with Andy, Frank's point about strengthening public opinion, the communications effort that needs to go on.
Yeah.
You feel that, don't you, Andy?
I do, and I think, I commanded a brigade within NATO that had responsibility for influence. And originally, it was perceived as some soft, fluffy, irrelevant, but actually it was tied together with joint fires and influence. Because if you want to change someone's behaviour, and certainly in the military, it's about behavioural change, not hearts and minds. It's about how do you stop people physically doing stuff. That's what deterrence is about. Then you've got to make them understand, and you can make them understand as you can with any audience, either by persuading them, and that is strategic communication, deterrence, etc., or by hitting them, the use of kinetic activity. And there's a balance that we have, but we in the military, I think, have tended to focus on the kinetic aspect and actually integrating that strategic communication with a clear message backed up by the potential use of kinetic activity is actually the thing that will change behaviours. And that, I think, is what whole of government and Stratcom and all of those words that no one really understands quite what they mean, but it's that integration that's so important in sending messages to our potential.
Okay, that's it. As you say, that's influencing potential adversaries. But Marina, in terms of home opinion and people who've got to pay for, whether it's AI-enabled new weaponry or whether it's paying people decently in the forces so we don't have manpower crises, and what would you say on that?
I fully understand, Frank, where he's coming from, right? But I'm sitting in Berlin, and I cannot wait for January 1st or for the day of the American election and wait for the result. As a strategist, I need to be prepared. And it doesn't mean that fear is driving my preparation. It's just that I need to set out different scenarios because, as we saw, if the United States holds the aid to Ukraine, the front is crumbling. Right? And so I think there needs to be, and this is not driven by fear, this is just driven by rationality and foresight, what planners do. There needs to be strategic thinking going on. What happens in the worst case scenario that Trump, for whatever reason, says, I'm pulling out the United States of NATO out of Ukraine. And I think this is, I think this is rational behavior. This is number one. Number two, I know we have AUKUS, enthusiasts here. This is fantastic. I'm happy for you. I'm German. I have no beef with AUKUS. But I think there is still a risk that AUKUS becomes an exclusive club and divides the unity of NATO and of the Western world. And I'm just putting it out there, right? Because there is, again, fantastic what you're doing. It can be transformational, as you just said, but I think it cannot be exclusive. It cannot be isolationist in the sense that actually it creates divisions among the rest of the Western parties.
Kevin, you want to come back on that?
I like Germany a lot. And I've been there a lot over the years with multiple German chancellors, and including the current chancellor, and know their staff and the work that they have done, particularly in response to Ukraine, but also the reorientation of German strategy towards China, the reorientation of NATO strategy towards China, the reorientation of European Union strategy towards China, where Germany has been instrumental. On the question of exclusivity, I think the way to look at it is as follows. There is this thing called the Five Eyes, and that's been around for the better part of 3/4 of a century. Finally, after 3/4 of a century of working as Five Eyes in the intelligence community, 3 of the Five Eyes decided to get together and create a seamless market in terms of defence, science, industry and technology with each other. We haven't quite finished the design yet. We're about several months off concluding it in terms of the regulations which will underpin the legislation which went through the United States Congress at the end of last year. Then we will be in a brave new world, the 3 of us, in terms of how do we then develop this so that our defence industrial base goes from where it has been, getting a concept or a technology from the laboratory into the hands of the warfighter after about 12 years, down to something closer to 2 years, which frankly is what the Chinese are now capable of doing. And that is why we have done what we're doing. Once this begins to acquire its own momentum, as you could see already by the engagement of the government of Japan on this question, then you'll start to see this open up in terms of collaborative arrangements between the AUKUS partners and other allied governments who wish to participate in AUKUS-specific projects in terms of advanced technologies. And so what I would see is if we do this well with each other, based on where we've been with each other for 3/4 of a century, and we prove this as a model for the future, and create at scale new industries across new capabilities across everything which will transform the battle space in the next 20 years, then frankly, the more we open the door to specific collaborations with our allied governments, the better. I think the better way, therefore, of looking at it, rather than the frame which you just put, is that this potentially opens up a whole new world for democracies, allied democracies writ large. But we, as the 3 initial partners, are just frankly at 3rd base, and we haven't even hit 4th base yet in terms of hitting a home run. Then it's time to begin opening the stable to others. That's kind of how we would see it.
And Mark, I said yesterday, I want to reiterate, the emerging view in the United States is that we need to deter Russia and China simultaneously, and that we can carry out treaty commitments to defend all of NATO with ground forces and allied air and naval forces. And we can carry out our treaty commitments to Japan, South Korea, Australia with maritime forces and air forces and allied forces. And within that, AUKUS is a subset which could grow to include more of the region. But I understand the fear about pivot to Asia. I do not see that happening. That is certainly not the plan. And we can handle both.
And sitting in Washington, to add to what Frank just said, there is the NSC, which is working in multiple domains simultaneously, and there are 3 of them at scale at the moment. Middle East, Ukraine, Europe, NATO, plus deterring war in the Taiwan Straits. The United States is well accustomed to walking and chewing gum at the same time, and this is one part of a wider ecosystem to unfold. So I think, frankly, given all the constraints of domestic politics, the financing of defence capabilities, inter-alliance politics, they're not doing too badly.
Marina, I'm going to throw it open in a moment, but I just wanted to ask you briefly, given what your point about, well, we have to anticipate what's going to happen in November in the US. Obviously, President Macron has been trying to lead in that respect. Is there a way that the sort of Franco-German motor can be developing that side of Europe while these other developments are, for the moment, focusing primarily on the Asia-Pacific region?
I mean, they're trying. As you probably saw in the news, there was the Weimar meeting in Weimar, Germany. But frankly, we need the UK, we need the United States, right? There is, like, for me, there is no option. But if we feel excluded, and that's why I think we need to have this discussion, if we feel that there is, you know, an implicit hostility toward continental Europe, and I'm putting this provocatively on purpose, then of course we're looking for other.
Well.
You know, that we have to think of a plan B. And the plan B for the time being is then a kind of a continental European solution. If this one fails, then we need to think of a plan B. And truth to be told, that's probably some kind of rapprochement then with Russia.
Maybe we should have the rapprochement at the Euro finals.
Exactly, yeah.
Or at the Eurovision Song Contest. I think this is a false debate about binaries in the mind of the United States. Secondly, for America's Asia-Pacific allies, ask yourself this proposition. If America's Asia-Pacific allies were indifferent to Europe, not hostile to Europe, or indifferent to Europe, well, why the hell have the South Koreans, the Japanese and the Australians thrown between them probably upwards of $5 billion worth of military kit and equipment into Ukraine? They are, in fact, as military contributors to Ukraine, more significant than a number of the NATO partners, even Australia, which has no obligations to Ukraine under any circumstances. It's $1.1 billion already. Japanese, significant. The South Koreans, significant. So the proposition that we somehow see this as a binary is less of a perception in our part of the world than I think it is in certain parts of Europe. And all I'd say is, knowing something about the American strategic mind, having lived and worked there as an analyst and think tanker, academic and now as an ambassador for the last 10 years, I don't see it. And we don't see it being a competition for American attention in terms of what they do with Europe, what they do with Ukraine. In fact, if we read carefully, both what Putin and Xi Jinping said most recently in their joint declaration, what they said most critically in their more expansive joint declaration of 2022, just prior to the invasion of Ukraine, that lays it out very simply as this is a partnership, a strategic partnership without limits. We therefore have a challenge in both hemispheres, and we need to understand that. And therefore we are looking at a world of seamless security increasingly, where geography matters less, it still matters a lot. And if you want the counterfactual to the above, cyber knows no geography.
And they need to understand that we will fight if necessary. And that we have the capabilities that we're rebuilding, per our two-day discussion, to fight if necessary, so that there are no misapprehensions.
I'm keen to take some questions, but I see there are no microphones. So whether right, let's start at the back there. Let's let's have a few questions. I've been told it's a hard out at 5-2 for Radek Sikorski, but we've certainly got a good 15 minutes for questions.
Okay, thanks. Andy Corbett, King's College London. I'm rushing now and I can't get my bloody words out. Right.
Don't worry.
We've heard yesterday, today, about deterrence, obviously. But can we be sure, or how confident are we, that looking forward with people like Putin and particularly Xi, that we're not just going through the same motions as we went through during the early part of the Cold War. And then when Jack Snyder started writing about strategic culture and the problems of mirroring, we're not just doing the same again with people who literally don't think like we do.
Yeah, misperception, I guess. Or
How much of NATO Europe has Putin attacked? How much of Australia, Japan, South Korea has Xi attacked? It's an open question. We know the answer.
Kevin, did you want to come in on that?
No, well, Frank's point is that deterrence works. And the underpinning anchoring element of deterrence lies in the singular power and capabilities of the United States as our common ally in all theatres. I think that's the first thing. The second is, in terms of mirror imaging, if that was the question. Look, I'm a lifelong student of the Chinese Communist Party. That's kind of my shtick. Chinese Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist party with a view of power, which Mao elegantly described as that which proceeds from the barrel of a gun. And therefore, if you look carefully at the way in which the PRC, through its Navy, its Air Force, and its other capabilities in East Asia and the West Pacific, is marshalling its capabilities, it understands that principle and therefore is seeking to give effect to its wider regional strategy, which has national reunification vis-a-vis Taiwan as its principal but not exclusive objective. And similarly, as the exponents of Marxist-Leninist statecraft, economic power, as we've seen through coercive forms of economic activity in relation to a range of countries in Europe and in Asia over the years, is similarly the exercise of that power to achieve a common foreign policy and security policy objective. I do not see there being a fundamental misreading of Chinese intentionalities on this question. Therefore, what I do understand is that the Chinese leadership, they are not reckless risk takers. They are calculated risk takers, and part of their calculus is the actual machinery of deterrence. And therefore, having integrated deterrence working as a rolling, animate and dynamic doctrine, frankly, is the best way of continuing to secure peace and stability, and in our part of the world, strategic equilibrium. I think similar principles apply in Europe.
Just very briefly, I think we have been at fault in the campaigns that Ed and I have been involved in the last 20 years, where we haven't fully understand the environment we're going into. And I think that leads me to deduce that actually the understanding that in the UK the FCDO and Department of State provide is absolutely critical. And it's very easy just to switch to frontline first and feed those and not think about the understand, which actually will build a path to a lasting solution.
Yes, because those who know Kevin's background, and very, very few people understand China as well as he does, speak the language, etc., etc. And if you look at the history in London over the last 10 years, then there was no one institutionally pulling together the sort of analysis that you alluded to when he talked about the combined sweep of grey zone operations. In fact, so subtle and clever is the statecraft, there are elements of the British executive that would cherry-pick bits, inward investment, etc., and show it as a positive. So to back up what Andy just said, I still think there's something about really understanding the people you're trying to deter and why, because if you don't, then you won't do that vital part of deterrence, which is communication. Because communication is about being understood, it's not just about being on transmit.
Gentleman at the centre there.
Hello, my name is Nick Acevedo. I'm from the Clemens Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. First, Mr. Rudd, thank you for talking about political will as a necessity for the alliance and for deterrence, and Lieutenant General for bringing up the balance of kinetic realizations as well as the political and communicative realizations of the necessity of political will. It brings the question of civilian-military relations, and thus I want to ask, how can civilian-military relations be improved at home in ally countries and leveraged as a way to generate political will to deter?
Well, I'm going to, I think, go to Andy first and then Ed, maybe.
Yeah, to start with, I think it's almost always about the human dynamics. You know, if these departments of state departments of state, whether it's the FCDO and the Ministry of Defence or the equivalent in our country, don't actually communicate on a regular basis and have built friendships over many years, then actually having in crisis a meaningful conversation where people are speaking and listening, then schisms will develop. And I think all of us probably have seen those schisms developed across governments. And then if you use words like one Her Majesty's government at the time and whole of government and that language, it means nothing if you don't have an established relationship where you can discuss really thorny issues and come to a unified national position that you can then build into coalitions and alliances.
Very briefly, I'd rehearse my previous argument about not being joined up to understand the full court grey zone press of China. If you don't have institutions that you work routinely in peacetime, you won't get the integrated effect that Frank mentioned earlier.
Marina?
I think in most of our societies here, and this is in Great Britain, this is certainly in Germany, but also in Western Europe, the politicians haven't fully understood that without security, everything is nothing. They haven't understood it. And this needs to be communicated. If they don't understand it because they don't see that they actually have political incentive to do so, it is still, for most people of us, it's more interesting to raise pension funds or to, have a better education system, have better healthcare. Even here, probably the election campaign that gets started, yes, there will be bits and pieces of defense, but as the Labour representative yesterday announced, it will be in the big picture of things, it will be about these social issues. For me, that shows people haven't understood. In my country, it's exactly the same. So I think that's why we here, experts in the field, need to change the discussion in the media, in all sorts of public fora that we can use and force them to listen and force them to focus. Because I think it really needs to come down to us to say enough. The top priority now needs to be security because the age we're in right now is very, very different from before.
I want to I spent 22 years in the Pentagon, rising to a senior civilian rank. I worked side by side with military people. I had people working for me with the commands. I think this issue is overblown. I think every time a new administration comes in and says, well, the Pentagon is run too much by the military or vice versa. That's just not true. It is a false issue by and large, and exactly what Ed and Andy have been talking about is it's the interrelationships, not only within the U.S. government, but with our various allied friends.
I do just, before I go on to the next question, pick up Marina's point, which is about where this ranks in the list of political priorities, because we've been having conversations for 2 days where clearly this is a very interested and often expert audience and certainly expert panels seized of the matter, as it were, about deterrence, about security. And yet, as Marina mentioned, we heard it straight from David Lammy, quite possibly our next Foreign Secretary. It's not out there on the doorsteps. And all of the opinion research shows that, particularly among the young, the idea that we should be spending more and more on national security is a hard sell. So, Kevin, is there not still a big task to be done for politicians, dare I say it, also media?
Well, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, security comes first, as others have reflected here. And security writ large is about the security of the realm, it's about security at home, it's also about economic security. And those of us who have been political practitioners kind of understand its multidimensional nature. The second thing is, in our democracies, we are constantly in the business as democracies of constructing and reconstructing the social contract, which actually underpins and fuels our democracies. Thirdly, authoritarian states do not have to do that until one day they explode, because their social contract, frankly, was ripped to pieces. And that is both the strength and, from time to time, the weakness of our democracies. I know which I would choose at the end of the day. On the question of the immediate priority to be attached to national security writ large, I would simply say this. If you speak to young people about the dangers of cyber intrusion, okay, cyber intrusion and about data privacy, let me tell you, there is a large constituency of opinion there to be mobilised in the direction of what we must now invest in and are investing in terms of comprehensive cyber defence. If you're looking at the community at large, you're looking at the vulnerability of economic infrastructure to cyber attack, which delivers your water, your electricity, your telco and the rest, let me tell you, there is a large constituency to be drawn together in order to secure funding necessary for those things. It's not simply about funding for aircraft carriers or for nuclear-powered submarines. That, of course, is one part of the equation and a critical part of the equation as well. Does the political class generally across all of our democracies need to do better at constantly explaining and re-explaining and redefining the nature of the national security challenge? Yes, that's a permanent condition of our democracies. But having been in office together with High Commissioner Stephen Smith before, I see George Brandis here from the other side of Australian politics as well, the bottom line is there is a rolling discourse with our communities, and we can increase our effort over time. Where we can never afford to get, frankly, is a return to the complacency which beset all of our democracies, derailed by different priorities altogether in the 1930s. Because that left us collectively naked and exposed. That is the enduring lesson for all the democracies, never ever for that to occur again. But I don't believe that's the current nature of the challenge that we face. Look at the Europeans, where they were 10 years ago on 2% of GDP as to where they are now in terms of their respective national defence efforts. Do they need to improve further? Yes. Do others who are friends, allies and partners of the United States need to improve? Yes. Where we're in Australia, 2.1 rising to 2.4, 2.5 over the course of the decade. So look, we often think that this glass is half empty. I think on balance, putting together the resilience of our democracies, the social contract, cyber awareness and cyber challenges, we're not doing too badly. Let's not talk ourselves down the drain.
Another question. Then, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Ben Baxendale Smith. I'm a PhD student here at King's College London, researching Australian Indo-Pacific strategy.
That's a worry.
Yes, it's a pretty short project so far. Ambassador Rudd, this question is aimed at you. As an explicit policy orientation...
Isn't it someone else's turn?
How did the US's pivot to the Asia-Pacific influence Australia's conception of China?
Australia's strategic perception of China has evolved as China itself has evolved. Stephen Smith and I were in cabinet together. And the China which we saw from 1978 onwards with the return of Deng Xiaoping to national leadership through Zhao Ziyang, through Hu Yaobang, through Jiang Zemin, through Hu Jintao, frankly is a different China to the China of Xi Jinping. What we began to detect, and you'll see this reflected in our own defence white paper of 2009, Stephen was Defence Minister at the time, I was Prime Minister at the time, was already publicly signalling, I'd commend you to read it if you're researching this, a clear articulation, perhaps first among the allies, frankly, of saying this is changing. China's pace of military expenditure, changing pattern of military exercise behaviour suggests something way beyond China's stated national security priorities. So what I would say is if your question is about the pivot, which came later, as far as the Obama administration was concerned, is that I think we ourselves simply saw different signals emerge in the national security space from China's evolving political leadership. That has become more accentuated in the period since 2012, and that is why we see more and more states arriving at comparable conclusions, both in terms of their national security policy and in our part of the world in terms of their force structure.
Gentleman with the microphone, yes. Sorry, okay. Robert, you've been preempted.
It does work? Hey, Colonel Chris Judge, American Army and assigned over in NATO, but I have a question just when we talk in terms of understanding, and it would come in two parts, and Prime Minister, I think you're the best person to answer this. Nixon's outreach in the early 70s, generally regarded as successful and quite prescient. And I would ask, just this in two parts, what did we
Did you say Nixon?
Nixon's
The
outreach to
Nixon
China?
doctrine? Okay. 68?
The second bit would be then in 1979 when the Chinese attempt to invade Vietnam and it doesn't go well for them. What did they learn from
Teaching
those?
Vietnam a lesson.
What should we learn from that? And understanding it's far enough in history that we should be able to draw something about how the Chinese think and understand them.
Sorry, do you want to?
All right, so I thought you were taking
No,
the question.
that's going to be the last one, I think, but let's...
Very quickly on the Nixon doctrine. What was the Nixon doctrine in 68 all about? I was at primary school. Is along these lines, was you allies should buck up and attend more to your own national defence and national capabilities. We, the United States, will come in when there is a significant at-scale threat to you from a principal Cold War adversary. That's our interpretation of the Nixon doctrine down under. What did that induce in the part of Australian defence doctrine over the years? Two sets of things: a greater sense of national defence, shall we say, self-reliance, but not to the exclusion of alliance responsibilities. And secondly, it induced in us a culture of strategic collaboration with the United States in terms of, shall we say, wider deterrence. So I think, you know, the legacy of the Nixon doctrine in terms of causing allies to conclude that it was not just up to Uncle Sam, but up to what we could do individually and then in partnership with the United States was actually useful in the overall evolution of things. Secondly, in terms of 79 and teaching Vietnam a lesson, I think it was China that was taught a lesson as a result of that, which is their then conventional capabilities were seen to be monstrously incapable in terms of dealing with the Vietnamese across the border. What it gave rise to, however, was a push, a fundamental push in the evolution of Chinese military doctrine, military capabilities and military learning, that they had to be infinitely better and better equipped than they were then. I think if you added to that China's sense, frankly, of national humiliation during the 1996 Taiwan crises across the Taiwan Straits, those things fueled together in Xi Jinping's doctrine announced early in his administration that he wants to build by 2027 PLA, which is, quote, modern, comprehensive, powerful and capable of fighting and winning wars. So failures in the past have given rise to a doctrinal resolution for the future, and the future is only 3 years away. That is when China has set the target for its own future military modernization accomplishment.
One last question.
Darius, I'm a student at King's College. My question relates to the point that was made at the very beginning of this panel regarding spending cuts and building capability and the job of politicians in that. Specifically because the reaction of politicians usually when there are security threats is to show off new shiny airplanes, is to show off new shiny missiles. And my question is both how do we communicate towards the population and how do we communicate towards politicians that actually we need those supporting elements, whether that's information operations, whether that's things like logistics, just as much as we need new combat capabilities.
Ed and Marina, I think, on that. Ed, do you want to go first?
I missed towards the end of what he said, and no one picked him up on it. John Healey talked about his reforms of the MOD, and if you look at what he announced on the 28th of February, the key shift was he is going to make people responsible for outcomes and accountable for outcomes. And if your outcomes are your ability to actually do deterrence as opposed to responsible for spending and buying the things you want, you will get different outcomes. You will get what you measure, and he plans to shift what you measure, and that's how I would go about it.
I'm actually a huge fan of transparency. I think our populations are much smarter than a lot of us think and a lot of politicians think, but we need to communicate, we need to explain, we need to seek the exchange. Sometimes that's a lot of work and we don't want to do it, but I think everything that you said is exactly right. but we can't shy away with it. And us elites, we need to push and force that the politicians actually do what we say.
One sentence.
We need to hold them accountable.
We need a better balance between conceal and reveal in the open communication with our communities around the world and the democracies about what we're up against, while mindful of that which we still need to maintain protective security around.
And you know, you talked about the less than obvious things, not the sexy airplanes and all. I think the United Kingdom, with what you're doing up in Barrow, with your attention to the defence industrial base, with all of our attention to our defence industrial base, I think governments have got that message and are spending a lot of time and trying to convince people that that's important.
There's jobs in it too, of course, in that sense.
And there are jobs in it.
The communication seems to be the key to it all. And on that thought, I'm very sorry, but we've come to the end of our assigned time for this panel, but I hope you'll join me in thanking them for a fascinating discussion.